Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of World War II and the home front, in this final lecture, we're going to talk about how Americans responded to one of the great crises of the era, Jewish refugees who were attempting to flee from Hitler and the Third Reich and the atrocities that were being done in Europe. And we'll see in this lecture how Americans came up short in their response to that crisis. We'll talk a little bit about why America didn't do more to help this group that was in dire need of assistance. The period we're primarily talking about with this issue actually is before the United States was actively involved in World War II. The period in the mid to late 1930s, when tens of thousands of Jews were attempting to flee from Germany, and particularly as the German military began to stretch its authority across Europe. Jewish groups from all over Europe attempted to escape while they still could. Many of them tried to make their way to the United States. A few, of course, succeeded, but many others failed in that effort. And the United States really didn't do as much as it could to accept in more of the Jews who were fleeing from Germany. FDR made no real attempt to alter American immigration legislation, no attempt to increase the number of Jews that might be allowed in. This remains a significant moral blot on our national record. Walter Mondale said in 1979, "We failed the test of civilization." In general, America's attitude to the Jewish immigrants was cold, even heartless. As one nativist said in 1918, "When the Bolshevists in Russia are overthrown, there will be a great massacre of Jews, and I suppose we will get the overflow, unless we can stop it." There's no reference in that statement to the human tragedy of people being massacred, only the thought that we might be inconvenienced by some who were trying to come here. Refugees from Germany had to try to surmount insurmountable barriers on their way out of Europe. From his first days in office, FDR was made aware of the intense anti-Semitism growing in Germany. And while he personally deplored it and didn't agree with what was happening, he had to weigh many sides of the issue. He couldn't just enact something that many Americans would have opposed. Also, in the early years, we must say that information was much sketchier than would come later. In 1944, as American troops liberated Europe, the full extent of the Holocaust became known. Of course, then it was much too late to help most of the victims. But clearly FDR did know some things about Hitler's anti-Semitism and some of the repressive programs that were being put in place in Europe. And he made no real effort to change American immigration policy. Instead, he listened to more conservative advisors, like Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who told him, "The status of all aliens is covered by law, and there's no latitude left to the executive to discuss questions concerning the legal status of aliens." Even so, it seems that the State Department went above the call of duty in making it difficult for refugees to enter the country. One historian has written that congressmen such as Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi and bureaucrats such as Breckinridge Long, who was in charge of refugees at the U.S. Department of State, did not help because they did not want to help. Let's talk about two examples and some of the ways that even slight changes might have made a difference. These are the cases of Arthur Spanier and Albert Lukowitz. Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati was very concerned about the condition of Jews in Europe and tried to get some of them out. This college petitioned the State Department to accept Spanier and Lukowitz, who were two Jewish scholars in Germany. The Immigration Act of 1924 allowed an exception from quotas to be made in the case of ministers or teachers. Would the State Department make an exception in this case? Spanier had been put in a concentration camp in 1938. Hebrew Union College guaranteed him a teaching spot if he was freed. That was enough for the concentration camp to let him go. But he wasn't admitted to the United States. The State Department said that the college he had taught at was not high enough level and turned him down. Spanier fled to the Netherlands, but that country was ultimately overtaken by Germany, and he was returned to a concentration camp where he ultimately died. Albert Lukowitz was also a professor in Germany, a philosopher instructor, and the college he taught at was recognized by the State Department. So that should not have been a problem. But Lukowitz's papers and records were destroyed in a bombing raid in 1940. Officials in the American consulate insisted that he supply his papers, if not the originals, then a copy provided by the German government, and of course they would never provide such a copy. One might understand this insistence, but in 1935, FDR had said, quote, "Consular officials have been instructed that in cases where it is found that an immigrant visa applicant cannot obtain a supporting document normally required by the Immigration Act of 1924, without the particular delay and embarrassment that might attend the request of a political or religious refugee, the requirements of such documentation may be waived on the basis of it not being available." No such waiver was made for Lukowitz. Like Spanier, he was sent to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where he lived for nearly 4 years in horrific conditions before finally being freed in a rare prisoner exchange in 1944. These were two relatively prestigious individuals with connections and guaranteed employment in the United States, and they were denied. Imagine an average individual and the difficulties they faced trying to navigate the vagaries of the American immigration system in a desperate attempt to escape from persecution in Europe. There were other examples of opportunities for the United States to help, which also were ignored. The Rogers-Wagner Bill, proposed to admit 20,000 Jewish children, died in committee without ever going to a vote. One opponent of the bill was heard to say, "Cute Jewish kids grow up to be ugly Jewish adults." In 1940, there were no objections to a similar bill allowing 15,000 British children to migrate. Also in 1939, the German vessel St. Louis, with about 1,000 Jewish refugees, sailed near enough to Miami to hear music from the beach. It was not accepted into the United States, ultimately returned to Europe, and many of the passengers eventually died in concentration camps. Over the course of the Third Reich, perhaps 150,000 German refugees, many of them Jews, did make it into the United States. But we never came close to filling the German quota during those years. From 1933 to 1940, there were more than 211,000 quota spaces for Germans. Less than half, only about 100,000 were used. FDR did relax one law, allowing visitor visas to be extended, and perhaps 15,000 or so didn't have to go back after their visitor visas expired. This is a small step, nonetheless. It saved perhaps thousands of Jewish lives. And in 1944, after the extent of the Holocaust had become clear, FDR did act. He created the War Refugee Board, which assisted in rescuing the remnants of European Jewry. Both of these efforts, though, come relatively late and could have done much more had we acted sooner. So why didn't the United States do more to help? Well, there are some explanations that are worthy of consideration. And truly, we didn't know the full extent of the tragedy. In the years in question, the mid to late 1930s, the thought of the horrors of Jewish extermination were beyond human comprehension. The fact that we are now able to sort of comprehend what Hitler and the Germans were doing is only because we now know they were doing it. So there is some validity in the thought that we didn't know and couldn't accept the full extent of the tragedy. But also underlying this is a considerable amount of nativism, racism, and anti-immigrant sentiment that has run all too common throughout America's history. We simply didn't want to allow in more immigrants, and particularly Jews. It's also been proposed that much of this period we were still mired in the Great Depression, and so the jobs were scarce, and we didn't want more competition coming in. And finally, there's the thought that we were afraid of Nazi spies or saboteurs being included in the numbers. If we start to allow in large numbers of Jewish immigrants, the Nazis will plant spies in their midst. And so all of these in some ways present a reasonable consideration, something that we had to be concerned about. But in the final analysis, and knowing that more than 6 million Jews perished during the Holocaust, would any of these have been worth the potential cost that we might have encountered because of it? With as many Jews who died in the Holocaust, and the slim percentage who did manage to escape, the few who did produced many remarkable accomplishments. Now, in fairness, we have to note that the population that was allowed to immigrate often was allowed to do so because they had achieved something already or showed great promise. But among their number were 2 Nobel Prize winners, Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann. Many of the minds behind the Manhattan Project, which ultimately built the atomic bomb, Enrico Fermi from Italy, Leo Szilard from Hungary, Lise Meitner from Austria, and many others. There were some remarkable musicians and composers among the survivors, Arnold Schoenberg of Austria, Bela Bartok from Hungary, and others. There were hundreds of academicians, scholars, and teachers who wrote dozens and dozens of important books and articles. And one future Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, pictured here. So if we account for the remarkable achievements of those who did survive, we can only wonder at the massive accomplishments that the world would never experience because of the millions of Jews who perished during the Holocaust, rather than an attempt to help and perhaps save them that could have been launched by the United States.